Sometimes silence isn't peace, it's a prison. A young nun vanishes without a trace. An abandoned chapel hides more than dust. A man sent to ask questions finds only closed doors and whispers that lead deeper than he expected. This isn't just the story of someone who disappeared, it's the story of what was meant to stay buried. But silence never lasts forever, does it? Part 1. The chapel that time refused. It was the kind of place time didn't just pass by, it deliberately avoided. The chapel stood crooked behind a stretch of aging cornfields, its wooden steeple leaning slightly like an old man favoring one leg. Wind passed through its splintered shutters like breath through cracked lips, carrying the scent of mold, rain-damp hymnals, and something older, something that felt like guilt. Father Malcolm Lewis stepped out of the county-issued sedan, his boots crunching on frostbitten gravel. The November sky pressed down in thick clouds, not quite threatening snow, but offering no warmth either. In the back seat sat 2 worn suitcases and a leather folder filled with quiet paper clippings, notes, and 3 unanswered letters sent by the diocese to St. Mary's Convent. The most recent one had come back unopened. That's when the bishop called him. St. Mary's had always been a quiet place, isolated, reverent, distant from the noise of Ohio's cities. But silence was one thing, disappearance was another. Malcolm had worn many uniforms in his life, first green, then black. He had served in desert outposts where heat peeled skin off bones and prayers sounded more like gasps. After years as a military chaplain, he had taken his vows again in civilian life, but the silence never left him. Neither did the things he saw, or the ones he buried. As he approached the weathered doors of the chapel, one of them creaked open before he touched it, not flung wide, just enough to let him in without asking. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and candle wax. Wooden pews stretched down the nave in perfect order, untouched by time, but everything smelled faintly of mildew and disuse. On the altar sat a tarnished crucifix and a single unlit candle in a brass holder. Malcolm stood there for a long moment, listening not just with his ears, but with the space behind his ribs, that space priests sometimes call the stillness of God and soldiers call the waiting before a shot. "Sister," he said, voice low. No answer. Only the sound of a draft slithering along the aisle. He walked deeper into the nave, his footsteps, soft but solid on the groaning wood. The back wall bore a faded mural of Saint Cecilia, her eyes lifted to a heaven that offered no reply. Above it hung a rusting bell rope, frayed from use but clearly untouched in months. The convent, a squat stone building attached to the chapel, held even fewer signs of life. The front office had an outdated calendar still stuck on August. Dust lay like a second skin on everything: the lamp, the typewriter, the framed photo of the original sisters who'd founded the place. All wore the same gentle smile. All but one. The folder in Malcolm's hand grew heavier. Among the contents, a picture of Sister Eliza Caro, barely 25, wide-eyed and warm-hearted according to her file. She had joined the convent 3 years ago, and her letters, once frequent and vivid, had suddenly stopped 6 weeks prior. The bishop hadn't used the word missing. He had said concerning, disruptive, spiritually disorienting. But in Malcolm's experience, when people stopped talking and places stopped answering, it wasn't the spirit that was trouble. It was the body. He lit the candle on the altar and sat in the first pew, letting the heat of the small flame press against the shadows. His breath rose in fog. Winter was early this year, or maybe something else had gone cold. He looked once more at Eliza's photo, her eyes seeming to peer just past him. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "What were you trying to say before?" The silence came, and from somewhere deep in the walls, or perhaps just in his chest, something old stirred. Something that had been waiting. Part 2. The nun who didn't say goodbye. The first thing Father Malcolm noticed was the stillness, not the holy kind, but the kind that arrived after something broke, and no one dared name it. When he stepped into the convent proper, the warmth of heat radiators greeted him, along with the faint aroma of lavender soap and boiled tea leaves. It was deceptively domestic, almost tender. Almost. Sister Agnes, who had opened the front door, was in her 60s, with a gentle posture and eyes that flickered too often to be fully calm. She welcomed him with folded hands and quiet words. "We've been expecting someone from the diocese," she said. "Come in. It's trying season." The halls of St. Mary's Convent were narrow, with walls painted the soft blue of old Catholic hospitals. Photos of saints lined the corridors. St. Therese, St. Catherine, St. Monaco, women who had endured much and spoken little. Their gazes seemed to follow Malcolm as he walked past. He was led to a small sitting room where 3 more sisters waited in silence, knitting and drinking weak tea. When introduced, they each smiled politely, almost automatically. Their names, blurred together, Sister Irene, Sister Margaret, Sister Celine. They wore the same modest habits, their silver crosses resting neatly below the throat. All appeared calm. None looked particularly surprised to see him. It wasn't until he asked about Sister Eliza that the air changed. Sister Eliza, repeated Sister Celine, glancing to the others. She was sensitive, said Sister Agnes slowly, but devoted. She always meant well. She used to sing while she worked in the herb garden, added Sister Irene, almost wistfully. But she hasn't been feeling herself lately, said Margaret, her fingers tightening around her teacup a bit. Trouble, perhaps. There was a pause. No one seemed willing to fill it. Was she transferred to another parish? Malcolm asked. Again. Silence. This time heavier. She left, said Sister Agnes finally. At least we assume so. You assume? Malcolm tilted his head slightly. You didn't see her leave? No, said Margaret. But her boots are gone. Her coat, too. Malcolm frowned. And her silver cross. The sisters exchanged glances. No answer. He asked to see her room. They hesitated, but Agnes led him down a short hallway to a modest wooden door locked. When she tried the handle, she shook her head. We haven't been in since, she said. We thought perhaps the bishop would decide what to do. Inside, Malcolm imagined the room just as she'd left it, bed still half made, a comb with loose strands of hair, maybe a stack of handwritten prayers folded under the pillow, but the locked door was louder than anything else. A sealed silence. He returned to the dining hall alone, hoping to glean something from the space where the sisters took their meals. The room was large, high-ceilinged, with long wooden tables, and windows fogged from the winter chill. A single candle burned at the center of one table, and beside it lay a prayer book, its pages gently curved from use. It was open. Curious, he approached. The name Sister Eliza was handwritten inside the cover in faded ink. The book lay open to a passage from the Psalms. He read it aloud softly. I have kept silence, even from good, and my sorrow was stirred. My heart was hot within me. While I was musing, the fire burned, then spake I with my tongue. He closed the book slowly. No one claimed it. No one moved to take it. The air felt just a little colder. The sisters returned to their routines, but Malcolm could sense the way. Their movements circled around the absence. Chairs not pulled out. Dishes washed too quietly. He noticed a pattern not of grief, but of avoidance, as though Eliza's absence were not tragic, but inconvenient, like a page torn from a hymnal, too damaged to sing from, but too sacred to throw away. Later that evening, he sat in the small guest room the sisters had prepared for him. It was plain but clean. A small desk, a Bible, a crucifix over the bed. He unpacked slowly, thoughts churning. Why had no one seen her go? Why was her room locked, untouched? Why had no one spoken her name unless asked? He took Eliza's photo from his folder again. She smiled brightly open, joyful, a young woman who looked like she believed in mercy. He couldn't reconcile that image with the silence she'd left behind. Outside his window, the convent grounds sat beneath the slate sky. Bare trees clawed upward in the fading light. Somewhere, out there, Eliza's boots had walked away. But where, and why, had no one asked the question out loud. Part 3. Beneath the floorboards. The chapel's back hall didn't appear on the original blueprint Father Malcolm had studied before arriving. It was narrow, colder than the rest of the building, and dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb that buzzed faintly overhead. The sisters had said the corridor led to an old storage room no longer in use, mostly filled with dust and forgotten hymnals, Sister Irene had said, with a wave of her hand, as if brushing off something inconsequential. But Malcolm had long ago learned that things brushed aside were often the ones most worth uncovering. As he walked, something beneath his boot shifted, not loudly, not alarmingly, just the faintest creak, sharp enough to make him stop. He leaned down and tapped the wood with his knuckles, hollow. The corridor led to a plain wooden door, its knob slightly rusted, its hinges resistant. With a gentle shove, it opened into a cramped room bathed in dust. The The air tasted like paper and old fabric. Stacks of crates lined the walls, many with rotting labels, seasonal altar cloths, Advent candles, retreat bedding. A broken rocking chair sat in one corner like a forgotten relic, its seat sagging and its arms smooth with age. Malcolm scanned the floor. More creaks. Near the far corner, beneath a pile of old linens and a collapsed coat rack, he saw it. Faint but unmistakable scratches. They weren't random. Long, arched grooves across the wood near the baseboard, as though someone had knelt there often, or clawed in haste, or desperation. He knelt, brushed aside the debris, and examined the panel. One edge jutted just slightly. He pressed his fingers against it. With a gentle tug, the board gave way. A hollow space revealed itself, maybe 2 feet wide and barely 6 inches deep. Not enough for anything substantial, but enough to hide something precious. Or dangerous. Inside lay a bundle wrapped tightly in faded linen. The fabric was stained with time, yellowed at the corners. When he unwrapped it, a neat stack of letters emerged, bound with red yarn that had once been vibrant but now faded to a murky rust. He held his breath as he untied the yarn. The first envelope was addressed simply to Elisa, no return name, no date. He pulled it from its sleeve and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was sharp but shaky, clearly written by someone educated, but disturbed. Eliza, I saw you at morning prayers. You look pale again. Please eat. Please sleep. Please don't ask questions. Not yet. There's more I need to say, but not like this. Soon. The second letter was more desperate. They think I don't see them watching you, but I do. And you don't deserve this. If you only knew what came before you. The ones who tried. I fear you're too brave. Please, Eliza, be still. Malcolm's fingers moved faster now, unfolding each page with increasing tension. One was soaked in what looked like water damage, perhaps tears, perhaps worse. The final letter was shorter. The writing had degenerated, the lines uneven, as if written in a rush or under duress. Forgive me, I was weak. I should have stopped them, but I didn't. And now, I fear it's too late for both of us. G. Malcolm stared at the signature for a long while. G. He flipped through the remaining letters, some torn, others half-written. All followed the same tone. Affection, fear, guilt. None suggested Eliza had written back, and yet she had kept them, hidden them. He repacked the letters carefully, restoring the bundle as he'd found it. The red yarn felt rough between his fingers, fragile, like a heartbeat that had been forced to continue in silence. He tucked the bundle beneath his coat and stood slowly, brushing the dust from his knees. A distant chime echoed from the front of the convent, a chapel bell, rung by habit before evening prayers. But Malcolm didn't move toward the sound. He stared at the empty compartment behind the floorboard and imagined the hands that had placed the letters there. Small, deliberate, trembling hands. Maybe Illy, maybe G's. Then he whispered into the still air. Who are you, G? And more importantly, are you still here? Part 4. Ghosts in the greenhouse. Father Malcolm hadn't expected a greenhouse. Certainly not one this large, and definitely not one this forgotten. It sat behind the convent like a secret the building tried to ignore, wedged between the old laundry house and a skeletal orchard, its glass panels fogged with moss and streaked with age. The iron frame had once been painted white, but now only rust remained, flaking like dried blood under the cold Ohio sun. Sister Agnes led the way, her steps slow but purposeful. This was her favorite place, she said softly. Sister Eliza used to spend hours here after morning prayers, said she liked how the plants listened better than people. The door groaned open, revealing a breath of stale, earthy air. It was a ghost of spring loam, wilted thyme, and the faint temps of lemon balm. Inside, vines of ivy had crept across every surface, curling over work tables and shelves, climbing up the glass like they were trying to escape. Most of the plants were long dead. Only a few stubborn herbs clung to life in the corner: sage, mint, perhaps some rosemary. Their scents barely registered under the weight of decay. Agnes bent beside a long wooden planter and brushed soil off an old watering can. She named every plant, she said with a smile that trembled. Even the weeds. Malcolm wandered farther into the space, his boots crunching over broken bits of clay and dried leaves. There was something uncanny about it all, how the vines grew thickest near the far end, as if drawn to something, or hiding something. He stopped before a low table covered in cracked pots and rusted tools. A trowel, twine, a pair of dull pruning shears, His eyes caught a shimmer of ceramic beneath a tangled clump of ivy. Carefully, he pulled back the vines. That it was a small angel figurine, about the size of a palm. White porcelain, though now hairline. Cracks ran across its wings like old scars. One wing had chipped off completely. It rested on its side, face down, half buried in dry moss. Malcolm lifted it and saw the note tucked underneath, folded small, almost like a prayer. He unfolded it gently, the paper brittle and yellowed, scrawled and narrow. Slanted handwriting were 7 haunting words. What if we are the ones sinning in silence? He read it again, then again. It wasn't a rhetorical question. Not in that place. He turned to Sister Agnes, who was now pruning a dying lemon verbena with deliberate care. Did Eliza ever talk to you about guilt? He asked. Agnes paused, her clippers hovering over a brittle stem. She asked difficult questions, she said finally. Questions that don't belong in quiet places. Like what? She once asked. If silence was the same as complicity, Agnes whispered. If obedience was just a more polite form of fear. And what did you say? Agnes didn't look up. I told her we pray in silence for a reason. Malcolm folded the note and slipped it into his coat pocket. A breeze slid through the cracked glass, rustling the ivy. The wind whistled as it passed, catching on the panes with a high, keening sound less like wind and more like a whisper that had been trapped too long and finally found a way out. He stared at the little angel, again its broken wing, its downcast face. Do you think she left this here? He asked. I think she left pieces of herself everywhere, said Agnes, her voice almost too quiet. They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the creeping green and the smell of damp earth and fading memory. Then Malcolm stepped back into the doorway and took one final look at the greenhouse, where everything seemed to either be dying or hiding. He didn't know which scared him more. Part 5, Midnight Confession. The convent was a place of routines, prayer bells, meal hymns, silence before sleep. But sometimes, between midnight and dawn, those routines fractured just enough for the truth to slip through. That was when people whispered. Father Malcolm was sitting by the oil lamp in his guest room, the soft scratch of pen on paper the only sound in the otherwise breathless air. He was copying a passage from one of the letters he had found, trying to understand G's trembling handwriting when he heard the knock. 3 taps, soft, hesitant. He opened the door to find Sister Celine standing in the hall, her shawl draped over her shoulders like armor against something unseen. Her face was pale and damp with the shine of anxiety, her eyes flickering like candles in a draught. I shouldn't be here, she whispered. Come in, Malcolm said, stepping aside. She didn't sit, she just stood near the window, her hands folded, bringing the edge of her sleeve between her fingers. She began, then faltered. You heard something, Malcolm said gently. The night Eliza disappeared. Her eyes widened in the dim light. She nodded once, then again, faster. I did, she whispered, but I didn't want to. I prayed not to. I told myself I imagined it, but I didn't. Malcolm waited. I heard a voice in the hallway. It was close, not Eliza's. A man's voice, soft, but angry, like he was trying not to wake anyone, but I could hear it from my bed. And what did it say? I don't know. I only caught pieces. Something about ending it. And then I heard Eliza. I think it was her. Say, not like this. Celine's lips trembled around the words. Then the chapel bell rang. Just once, a single note. Malcolm frowned. At what time? Exactly midnight. Who rings the bell at midnight? No one. That's the thing. There's no prayer at that hour. No reason to ring it. I went down 10 minutes later. The rope was still swaying, but no one was there. She finally sat, resting her hands in her lap. Her fingers still wouldn't stay still. We all heard it, she said. But the next morning, Mother Imelda said there had been no sound, no bell, no voices. She said it was the wind. You disagreed. Celine hesitated. I didn't dare. None of us did. That's how it works here. If you speak, you're dismissed. Or worse. She looked away. You're watched. Malcolm's chest tightened. Do you believe Elisa left? Celine reached into her pocket and pulled something out, slowly, as if it weighed more than her strength could carry. A rosary. The beads were dark wood, worn smooth in places. The crucifix at the end was simple but delicate. with initials scratched into the back EM. She dropped it behind the altar. Celine said, "We weren't supposed to find it. We were cleaning after Vespers, and I noticed the candle holder was off-center. When I moved it there, it was." "Did you tell anyone?" She shook her head violently. "I kept it hidden. I didn't know who to trust. Until now." He reached for the rosary. Her hands were iced hot. Malcolm turned it over in his palm. The initials, the weight, the smell of candle wax, still clinging to the wood. He knew what it meant. "She never left," he murmured. "She was still here hours after Vespers." Celine stood. "That silence," she said, almost to herself, "is killing us." Then she slipped out the door and disappeared into the corridor. The hallway fell still. Malcolm turned the crucifix over one last time. Something told him it had been placed behind the altar on purpose. Not dropped. Left. For someone who would care enough to find it. Part 6. The letter that burned. The rectory at St. Mary's wasn't much, just a narrow stone room with creaky floors, a modest desk, and a fireplace that hadn't seen real warmth in years. Father Malcolm had been using it in the evenings, lighting small fires more out of ritual than necessity. Something about flame helped him think, reminded him of old camp posts, nights on foreign soil, the quiet after danger. He wasn't expecting answers from Ashdod, but that night, he found one. It was nearly 11 p.m. The halls had gone quiet. The nuns were tucked into their prayers or their silence. Malcolm, too restless for scripture, had returned to the rectory to review his notes again. That's when he saw it, the faint scent of burnt paper lingering around the hearth, the kind that didn't belong to old logs or newspaper kindling. He crouched near the fireplace, dragging the poker through cold ash. At first, it seemed like nothing. Then, just beneath a layer of soot, he spotted it, the curled edge of an envelope, blackened, half-consumed. He pulled it out with tongs, careful not to let it crumble. The paper was thin and fragile, its corners already breaking like dried leaves. Most of the writing had vanished into smoke, but 3 words remained, faint but legible. She knew everything. He stared at the phrase. The handwriting, looped and precise, was immediately familiar. It was the same hand as the letters he'd found beneath the floorboards, the ones written to Sister Elisa, the ones signed simply G. And Malcolm took out his journal and compared the strokes. Identical. He spread the rest of the burned paper out gently across the stone floor. Most of it was gone, nothing but veins of ash and a few twisted fibers. Still, he nudged them apart with the end of a pencil, clearing soot like an archaeologist at a sacred site. And then he saw it, a faint mark at the top corner of the envelope, barely there, nearly erased by flame, but still distinguishable under the right angle of lamplight. A cross, not the traditional Christian kind, but more geometric, 4 equal bars intersecting within a circle, stark, controlled, and familiar. His stomach dropped. He had seen that symbol before, in a past life, in a locked room under fluorescent lights, pinned to briefing folders, stamped classified. It was a symbol used by covert chaplain corps during wartime, those involved in special clearance rights, or spiritual cover for certain ... operations. He hadn't thought about that part of his past in years. Why would it be here? He opened his notebook and sketched the symbol again, noting its dimensions. It wasn't decorative. It was code, or worsened, identified. A mark of an inner circle, possibly a secret religious sect, the kind that used penance as power and silence as currency. Was Eliza part of it, or had she uncovered it? And if she had known everything, who would want to make sure she stayed silent? The envelope said it plainly. Not that she guessed, not that she suspected, that she knew. The wind outside howled suddenly, rattling the old windows of the rectory. The flames in the hearth flickered. Malcolm watched the last corner of the letter crumble into itself, the words vanishing with a soft hiss. All that remained was the symbol and the silence of things long buried, just now beginning to claw their way back up. Part 7. A name in the wall. The stairwell between the chapel and the convent dormitories was always dim. A narrow shaft of gray light filtered through the single stained glass window during the day, but by night it was little more than a corridor of creaks and shadows. Most of the nuns took the longer route through the garden cloister to avoid its gloom. Father Malcolm, however, had started using it deliberately where shadows gathered. Secrets often rested. It was during one of those twilight crossings, his thoughts still tangled in the burnt letter's cryptic symbol, that something odd caught his eye. A section of the faded floral wallpaper no longer fully adhered had curled up at the corner near the fourth step from the landing. It wasn't obvious, unless one was close to the wall, walking slowly, thinking deeply, which he was. He paused, tugged gently, and the brittle edge of wallpaper peeled back like old skin. Beneath it, the wooden beam had been scrawled in light, hurried pencil. Eliza plus Grace. No turning back. The names stopped him cold. Eliza, of course, but Grace. His breath slowed as he ran his thumb across the rough grain of the writing. It wasn't elegant. It was rushed, urgent, like a warning or a pact. The last three words weren't just dramatic. They were deliberate. No turning back. A name on a wall wasn't evidence, but in a convent where silence hung heavier than the crucifix, even a scribbled name was a cry. He closed his notebook, pulled his coat tighter, and made his way straight to the greenhouse. Sister Agnes was pruning dead leaves from an herb box when he found her, her weathered fingers gentle despite the frost outside. She was always calm, always tending. That's why Malcolm trusted her. She seemed less concerned with piety, more with truth. I need to ask you something, he said. She looked up, hands still busy with the basil, then asked it, who was Grace? The shears froze. For a moment, all he heard was the rustle of ivy against the greenhouse glass. Sister Agnes slowly stood straight, brushing soil from her apron. She wasn't one of us, she said, eyes not meeting his. Not formally. What does that mean? She lived nearby, in the abandoned rail depot by the south tracks. A runaway, maybe 15, maybe 20. Nobody really knew. She lived there, for a time, came and went, slept behind the chapel some nights, ate what we slipped her. She had fire, anger, but gentleness, too. And she and Eliza, they became close. How close? Agnes finally looked up, close enough for Eliza to start questioning things, rules, vows, the meaning of suffering. Malcolm nodded slowly. Did Grace know something? I think she knew everything. Agnes walked to a small wooden crate and pulled out an old, rusted key. She handed it to Malcolm. This opens the back gate, leads down to the old rail path. It's overgrown now. Nobody goes there anymore. He looked at the key. Iron, heavy, cold. What happened to Grace? He asked. Sister Agnes hesitated. Some say she left, she said finally. Some say she was taken. Taken by whom? Agnes returned to her herbs. We never asked. Malcolm tucked the key into his coat pocket. As he turned to leave, she called after him. She wore a silver ring with a crack through it. She said, if you find that, then you'll know she didn't run. Part 8. The girl near the tracks. The morning had a pale cast to it, as though the sky itself were reluctant to wake. Father Malcolm stepped over the frost-laced stones of the old garden path, the iron key from Sister Agnes cold in his pocket. He had spent the night sifting through memories, not his own scribbled names on walls, a cracked ring, a burnt letter. Now, they led him here, toward the broken past. The path behind the convent was nearly forgotten. Roots had claimed most of the stones, and thorned vines clawed at his coat sleeves as he made his way deeper into the wood. This was not a place meant to be found. After nearly 2 hours of trudging through waist-high brush and oversagging fences, he saw it. The skeletal remains of a rail depot crumbling under the weight of decades. The once red bricks had browned with time, moss gripping the corners like ghostly fingers. There was no roof, only a timber frame like ribs exposed to the cold sky. The tracks behind it had rusted into oblivion, broken and overrun with dead grass. It felt as though the world had grown around it, deliberately trying to erase what once stood there. Malcolm approached cautiously. The inside of the station was damp and eerily quiet. Every sound he made echoed each step, each breath. The pews were long gone. In their place were makeshift pallets of rotting cloth, old bottles, and scraps of paper. But it wasn't empty. A figure stirred behind a cracked wooden column. She rose slowly, wrapped in a dirty quilt, eyes squinting against the light. Her skin was wind-bitten and pale, hair matted into a tangled mass of one-star curls. You're looking for her, she said before he could speak. Malcolm hesitated. Your Grace. She blinked, as though the name carried weight. Then, slowly, she nodded. He took a cautious step forward. Eliza was looking for you. She found me first. Grace interrupted, voice dry as paper. And then she tried to leave. Leave the convent. Leave the lies. Grace moved to the side, revealing a makeshift bed of coats and trash. In the corner was a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She pulled it close, cradling it like something sacred. She knew, and they knew, she knew. Knew what, Grace? What did she find? Her fingers tightened around the bundle. Her eyes darted to the broken window, then back to him. In the cellar. She was down there 2 days before she disappeared. Came back with dust all over her dress and fire in her eyes. Said there was a room, a locked one, not on any of the maps. A room in the church cellar. Grace nodded. She said it wasn't storage. Said she saw names, records, hidden boxes. Said the walls had things written on them in red, not paint. The hairs on Malcolm's arms stood on end. He swallowed. Did she tell anyone else? She wrote it down. I saw her. She was going to send a letter to someone in Cincinnati, I think. But then Sister Celine started following her, and then ... She was gone. Grace looked away. Her voice turned small. They never asked about me. They only asked if she said anything. They came here once, a man and a nun. I never saw them again. Malcolm crouched beside her. Do you still have anything of hers? Anything she left? Grace slowly unwrapped the bundle. Inside were a small notebook with frayed edges, a single ballet, flat stained at the toe, and a photograph of Eliza, laughing, half turned toward the camera. Malcolm recognized the backdrop, the convent greenhouse. He took the notebook carefully and opened it. The writing was sharp, intense. Drawings of the convent floor plan, a map of the cellar, notes, door behind the icon, not on blueprints, Sister Miriam Lee. Then one line, scrawled over and over, asterisk, asterisk, they watch, who watches. They watch, who watches, asterisk, asterisk. He closed the book. Grace was staring at the floor. Will you help her? She asked, barely audible. Malcolm stood slowly. I will find the truth. As he left the station, the wind rose. It blew through the broken depot like a memory, scattering dust and whispers. The trees seemed to close in behind him. Eliza had found something, and someone had buried it, but not deep enough. Part 9. Secrets Beneath the Cross. The return to St. Mary's was marked by a silence heavier than snowfall. Father Malcolm stepped into the chapel as the late afternoon light slanted through stained glass, painting fractured reds and golds on the warped wooden floor. The air smelled of wax, dust, and something colder, something forgotten. He moved purposefully to the altar, where the chapel's crucifix hung, time-worn and solemn. For days, everything had pointed here to something beneath. The cellar door, hidden behind an old tapestry, gave a protesting creak as he pried it open. A rush of stale, damp air rolled out, heavy with mildew and centuries of secrets. He lit a lantern and descended slowly, the steps groaning under his weight. The darkness below was absolute. Cobwebs hung in thick sheets like gauze across the narrow stone hallway. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with hymnals, long abandoned, and wooden crates labeled with faded ink. Mice scurried at the edges of his light. But it wasn't the storage that caught his eye. It was the wall behind the altar. An old crucifix was bolted into the stone, slightly askew. Malcolm stepped forward, heart tightening. He grasped the edges of the wooden cross and tilted. It gave a subtle click. The wall behind shifted slightly. Kneeling, he ran his hand along the mortar and felt the edge of a concealed panel. With effort, he pried it loose. Dust exploded into the air, choking his lungs. Beneath it, a trapdoor, iron-ringed and locked with a latch so rusted it nearly crumbled. Under his force, the door opened with a reluctant shriek, revealing a stairwell descending deeper than the foundation of the chapel itself. He followed it down into what could only be called a vault. The room was small, circular, and smelled of cold stone and ink. Candles, melted down to their nubs, lined shallow niches in the wall. At the center was a table. On it, 3 ledgers, stacked neatly, and a locked metal box. That the ledgers were church records, but not the public ones. These were personal, annotated with names and dates, marked in hurried ink and coded shorthand. Transactions, payouts, assignments. One page had Eliza's name next to a large sum. Circled in red. The metal box was heavier than it looked. Malcolm used a rusted crowbar from a corner to pry it open. Inside were sealed envelopes, stamped and aged. Some were confession records, others, dossiers complete with photos, school transcripts, psychological profiles. He froze. One file was marked Grace Elliott, another, Eliza Romanoff. Flipping through, he saw signatures from high-level church officials. Transfers approved, warnings issued, silences enforced. Then, beneath the stack, he found something else. A photograph. Eliza, again, but not at the convent. She stood with 3 other young women outside what looked like a clinic. All wore identical silver crosses. Behind them, the same emblem that had been burned onto the half-destroyed letter. This was not just a convent. It had been a part of something wider, something secretive. Malcolm's hand trembled slightly as he packed the documents into his satchel. Somewhere above, the chapel bell gave a single hollow ring. The sound didn't echo it, dropped like a stone. Someone knew he was down here, and he had just crossed the line. Part 10, Whispers at Vespers. The bell rang out slowly across the frostbitten convent grounds, its somber toll signaling the hour of Vespers. Evening shadows crawled along the chapel walls as the sisters filed into the pews, habits brushing against cold stone and wooden floorboards that creaked with fatigue. Father Malcolm stood near the back, watching the worn faces of the nuns illuminated by candlelight, some in quiet reverence, others haunted by something unspoken. The air was heavier tonight. As the prayers began in a murmured rhythm, a kind of tension buzzed just beneath the Latin verses. Something unseen stirred in the silence between each syllable. Sister Celine, always pale and delicate, was kneeling in the second row, her eyes fluttering open and shut as if trying to stay awake, or trying not to faint. Malcolm watched her, hands clasped tighter than any others. He saw her lips move, not with the prayers, but with something else, a mantra, a warning. Then it happened. Her hands loosened, her eyes rolled upward, and with a faint gasp, Sister Celine collapsed sideways onto the stone floor, her rosary scattering like spilled seeds. The chapel froze. Candles flickered violently. A few sisters cried out, while others rushed to her side. Father Malcolm knelt beside her, fingers to her throat. There was a pulse, shallow but present. Dot in her right hand, clenched with her final ounce of strength, was a torn page, smudged, ink blurred by moisture. Malcolm slowly unfolded it. It was a page from Eliza's journal. They knew. I saw the books. It read, not the public ones, the ones in the cellar, the real ones. I wasn't meant to see them. I have to disappear, or they'll decide for me. The room rippled with panic and disbelief. Sister Agnes whispered a prayer under her breath. Sister Irene turned away, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Sister Prudence began muttering about divine punishment, but Malcolm stood still, reading the page again and again, as if the ink might shift and reveal more. Celine was taken to the infirmary, her breath now steady but her mind elsewhere. The attending nun, a former nurse from a Boston hospital, said it looked like a panic-induced seizure brought on by extreme stress. But Malcolm didn't believe that, not entirely. He visited Celine later that night. She was awake but groggy, her skin damp with sweat. Did someone give you that page? He asked softly. Dot. She hesitated, then nodded. Slipped it into my prayer book. This morning, she whispered. I think someone wants us to know. Malcolm pulled a chair close. Do you know who? She shook her head slowly. But they know everything we say. They hear us through the walls. He frowned. You mean someone is spying on the sisters? She looked away. I mean, this place listens. It listens and remembers. Malcolm said nothing. The convent had begun to feel like a living thing, walls that pulsed with old grief, air that carried whispers no one admitted to hearing. That evening, the sisters did not finish Vespers. The chapel remained dim, half prayers lingering in corners like unfinished songs. Outside, the wind had picked up swirling dry leaves across the gravel paths. Somewhere in the trees, a bird called once and then went silent. Malcolm took the journal page to his room, spreading it beside the others he'd collected. When placed in sequence, they began forming a timeline, a slow unspooling of Eliza's final days. Every entry edged closer to something she'd uncovered, something she feared, something that left her with no choice but to run, or to vanish. He wrote in his notebook. Someone tried to warn Celine, but who? And why now? Then, a second thought, unless someone wanted to silence her next. A knock on his door jolted him. It was Sister Agnes. She didn't speak. She simply handed him a worn book, older than any he'd seen in the convent. Inside were pressed flowers, faded photographs, a name written in elegant cursive, Grace. Part 11. The bell tolls again, at precisely 2 a.m., when the convent of St. Mary's should have been wrapped in the velvet of sleep. The silence shattered with a sound that didn't belong to the hour. The chapel bell rang just once, low, deliberate, and haunting, like a call from something ancient or forgotten. Father Malcolm awoke in the rectory with a chill crawling up his spine. He'd barely slept, and the journal pages on his desk glowed dimly in the candlelight. Liz's journal, still open to the page, where she'd written, "They knew I saw the books. I have to disappear." He grabbed his coat and flashlight, hastily slipping into his boots, and stepped into the hallway. The wind groaned outside, brushing against the old stone walls. A draft crept through the floorboards like a breath. All doors, along the corridor, were shut, cloistered tight. Only the occasional flicker of a votive candle betrayed that anything lived within these walls. The bell tower door should have been locked, had been locked. Yet the old iron handle yielded to Malcolm's grip with an eerie ease, like it had been waiting. The spiral staircase groaned underfoot. Each step was a creak in a building not meant to speak. The stone felt colder here, and older, as if the tower had its own memory of things it wished buried. As he ascended, a faint fragrance met his nose. Lavender, no sandalwood, Eliza's scent, unmistakable, from the few moments he had seen her photo in the infirmary. Her veil braided with sprigs of dried herbs. At the top, moonlight sliced through narrow slats in the wall, casting sharp silver lines across the chamber. The bell hung silent, still rocking gently from its movement. The rope beneath it was swaying slightly. Not from the wind, there was no wind here. He moved closer. His flashlight beam caught something fluttering near the pulley, a strip of white lace. No, not just lace. It was a veil, thin hand-stitched, with edges frayed from time or struggle. Malcolm reached out, eyes narrowing. On the hem, just barely visible, was a tiny blue cross, the same cross from the photo in the infirmary. The veil was Eliza's. He had no memory of how long he stood there, holding it in his palm like it might vanish if he blinked. The lace was faintly warm, not from heat, but from presence. It felt like a whisper, like a hand on the shoulder, like forgiveness waiting to be spoken. He looked around, shining his light into corners, cracks, cobwebs. Nothing. No footprints, no movement, only the veil, only memory. As he turned to descend, he heard a sound, not footsteps, not breath, a sigh. He froze, then slowly moved downward. When he reached the chapel, the candles had gone out, all but one. Sister Irene sat in the front pew, eyes closed, fingers tightly knotted in prayer. "You heard it," she said, without looking at him. Malcolm nodded, placing the veil carefully on the altar. "No one should have access up there. No one that's alive," she whispered. He lit a new candle. The flame caught quickly, steady and defiant. In its glow, the veil shimmered. He stared at it, the way someone might stare at an old photograph found after years of forgetting. Not just cloth, not just proof, but a message. Eliza hadn't left. At least, not all of her. Her truth remained, suspended like the veil in the cold air. And someone or something wanted that truth seen. Part 12. The Broken Vow. The morning light had barely pushed through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's when Malcolm descended the stone stairs into the administrative wing of the convent. The smell of polished wood and incense still hung in the corridors, but to him it was the scent of delay ritual masking reality. He knocked once on the thick oak door bearing a bronze plaque, Mother Superior Magdalene. A pause followed, long enough to make him question whether she would answer. Then, softly, the door opened. Mother Magdalene stood in full habit, her expression composed, almost serene. She gestured for him to enter, offering a seat across from her desk. The room was tidy, sun filtering through the slats behind her, painting stripes on the dustless floor. "Father Malcolm," she began, "I assume you've come with questions." He didn't sit. "I've seen the ledgers," he said flatly, "and Eliza's journal. Her veil was found tied to the chapel bell. This is no longer just a matter of absence. This is cover-up." Magdalene didn't flinch. She folded her hands atop a worn leather-bound Bible. "She was a good soul," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "but misguided, or righteous." The air between them thickened. She wanted to expose things. Malcolm continued. The payments from silent donors, the disappearance of Sister Grace, the locked files in the rectory safe. She wasn't running away. She was silenced. Magdalene's jaw tightened. Her calm began to crack. She didn't understand the weight of history, she said, the tremor in her voice, belying her authority. The traditions, the vows. We're not just women of faith, we are stewards of an order that predates even memory. Did you discipline her? Malcolm asked. That word discipline hung in the air like an iron bell. Magdalene looked down, then away, and when her voice returned, it was small. I told her to stop, that no good would come of it, that it would only bring shame and scrutiny and destroy what little good we had left. She wrote, they'll decide for me. Did you decide for her? Silence. Her eyes filled but did not spill over. She was fighting something, guilt, fear, or perhaps the urge to finally speak. We gave her solitude, isolation, at first, then, we stopped checking on her. You locked her away, he said. No, she snapped. Not at first, but she chose the cellar, to copy the ledgers, to make notes, to gather proof. One day, we found the door locked from the inside. When we broke in, she was gone. A rope down the dumbwaiter shaft. A window open, but no footprints in the snow. Did you search? We prayed. He stepped closer, placing Eliza's veil on the desk like a shroud. She left this behind, on the bell. Someone hung it there. It wasn't the wind. Magdalene stared at the lace, the cross-stitched in blue thread. I didn't kill her, she said, barely audible. But I didn't stop what was coming either. She was going to ruin everything. Malcolm repeated her words. Magdalene looked up. And for what? A world that wouldn't understand us. She believed the truth was holy, Malcolm said. You believed the silence was. The air felt heavier. Somewhere outside, the wind picked up again, shaking the chapel rafters. Mother, Magdalene stood and turned toward the window. Her shoulders, once a symbol of authority, now sloped under the weight of everything unsaid. We took vows, she whispered, but some of us broke them long before she did. Part 13, Letters Never Sent. The late afternoon sun barely pierced through the dust-flecked window panes of Eliza's abandoned room. The chamber had remained untouched, as if preserved like a saint's relic, quiet and sunken in its own pocket of time. The scent of lavender water and wax still lingered faintly, clinging to the quilted bedspread and the prayer kneeler beneath the sill. Father Malcolm stepped in quietly, closing the door behind him, sealing himself within the echo of her absence. He'd been here before, but only briefly, only to look. Now he had to see. He began with the small desk by the wall. It held a porcelain lamp, the shade slightly tilted, and a thick layer of dust that suggested no one had dared disturb it since her disappearance. He opened each drawer carefully. Inside the top, a rosary missing its crucifix. In the second, blank stationery, the kind reserved for official correspondence, stamped with the crest of St. Mary's. In the third, nothing but an empty envelope, torn at the corner, as if it had once carried something important. Malcolm turned to the narrow cot. It was neatly made, though the pillow bore the faintest indentous. If someone had laid there with a troubled head for hours. He knelt beside the bed and, with slow fingers, lifted the thin mattress. There they were, a dozen envelopes, bundled, with twine, yellowed at the corners, but otherwise pristine, each addressed in Eliza's careful handwriting, all to newspapers, local, regional, even national. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Catholic Reporter. His heart pounded as he read the names. He untied the bundle. Each letter was written with steady, unflinching purpose. They began the same. To whom it may concern, I write not in anger, but in duty. Eliza had detailed dates, names, amounts of money, quiet donations from anonymous benefactors, hush payments made in the name of maintaining discipline, a ledger of transferred nuns and disappearing postulants. She wrote of Sister Grace, of whispered confessions, not absolved but buried, of threats veiled as guidance, of vows broken not by sin, but by silence. She had known, and more than that, had planned to speak. Malcolm read for nearly an hour, the sun dipping low behind the horizon. Candlelight soon became his only source. Each page burned brighter in the glow. Eliza had not only documented everything, she had been methodical. There were footnotes referencing the convent's books, names cross-checked from community rosters. She had even mentioned him, Father Malcolm Lewis, though only briefly, and only in the context of being a new arrival. None of the letters had been mailed. The stamps were tucked into a small envelope nearby, still untouched. A book of 50, not a single one was missing. Eliza had written the truth, her truth, but never had the chance to send it. Had she hesitated, or had someone intervened before she could? Malcolm gathered the letters and placed them into his satchel. He returned the room to its former state, folding the blanket, smoothing the pillow, lowering the mattress. But he left a single candle burning on the desk, not for illumination but for memory. As he walked back through the hallway, the walls seemed narrower, the shadows longer. At the far end, Sister Agnes stood waiting, her expression unreadable. "You went into her room," she said. "I had to," Malcolm replied. She was ready to speak. She was trying. Agnes nodded, slowly. She wasn't the first. The words halted him. "What do you mean?" "There was another, years ago, a novice named Teresa. She left letters too. They disappeared. Did she? No one knows. One day she was gone. We were told she had a calling elsewhere." Malcolm stared at her. "And you believed that?" Agnes didn't answer. Her eyes darted to the candlelight glowing from Eliza's window. "We all made choices," she said finally. "Some of us stayed quiet. Some of us ... regretted it." He let the silence stand between them, heavy and unresolved. Then, with a nod, he continued toward the rectory, the letters secure beneath his coat. That night, he sat by the fireplace, the flames licking shadows across the ceiling. He spread Eliza's letters across the floor in a fan, arranging them chronologically. It was a map not of places, but of truths, hidden in plain sight. A chronology of guilt. And then he saw it. A symbol at the corner of one letter faint, almost invisible, a small cross, encircled by a crown of thorns, not unlike the one he'd seen half-burned in the rectory hearth. The same one that had marked old military briefings, a symbol of a closed order within the church's secret arm used to deal with scandals, quietly and without witnesses. He scanned the rest. 3 other letters bore the same mark, that Eliza had been watched, targeted, and maybe not by one person, but by an entire system. The wind howled against the walls. He closed his eyes and listened not to the gusts, but to what they might carry. And from somewhere within the convent, the chapel bell groaned once, not in ringing, but as if swaying in its sleep. He would not let this die like Teresa's story. He would finish what Eliza began. Part 14. The Crossroads. The wind came in strong from the north, carrying with it the scent of wet iron and old wood. The train tracks, rusted and swallowed in overgrown weeds, stretched endlessly in both directions, like threads unraveling from the cloth of some forgotten fate. Malcolm stood at the crossing alone, distant from the convent's stony silhouette, with Eliza's letters clutched in one hand and her delicate veil folded in the other. The veil, still embroidered with its tiny blue cross, seemed weightless compared to the ink-heavy truths resting in the envelopes behind him. St. Mary's stood like a tomb, its tower peeking above the misted treetops. Before him, the tracks disappeared into a distant horizon blurred by wind and uncertainty. He hadn't returned here to contemplate. He had returned to decide. Each step along the path that brought him here was laced with whispering journal pages Sister Celine had hidden in her habit, the rust-stained trapdoor beneath the altar, the coded ledgers and burned confessions, each fragment leading him away from obedience and toward rebellion. But it wasn't only about Eliza now. It hadn't been for a while. She had merely torn open the wound. His boots crunched over the gravel as he stepped onto the tracks. The wind howled low, a sound like groaning steel and mourning hymns. He looked at the veil in his palm. She must have known what silence would cost her, and yet she wrote everything down. She didn't send the letters, but she wrote them. She hoped. In the nearby underbrush, a shattered telegraph pole leaned like a drunk sentinel, its wires hanging like veins drained of purpose. He stood at that intersection of past and future, of sanctuary and consequence. His choice was not just a matter of exposure. It was the weighing of souls, the lives shattered by truth, the ones shielded by ignorance, and the price one pays to speak in a world that rewards those who stay silent. The veil slipped slightly from his grasp. He gripped it tighter. There was the choice to send the letters. He could return to town, walk into a newsroom, place these envelopes into the hands of someone who would understand their weight. Names, dates, crimes, a ledger of systemic betrayal. But there was also the cost, not just to the convent, but to the old sisters whose days were numbered and whose nights were spent in prayer for sins they barely remembered, to the girls who still believed they were protected by faith, to the sick and the vulnerable who relied on St. Mary's shadow for comfort. If he burned the letters, it would be as if none of it had happened. Eliza would be a name whispered by wind and candlelight, a tragedy folded into legend, but silence wasn't peace. It never had been. He sat down on a splintered railway tie, laying the veil across his knee. He unfolded the top envelope and read the salutation aloud, to the Chicago Tribune, ... His voice was steady. This is the testimony of Sister Eliza Monroe, ... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Malcolm pulled from his coat a silver lighter remnant from military days, its body dented, scratched, but dependable. He lit the flame and held it near the corner of the letter. It curled slightly, round at the edge. He hesitated, then he extinguished it. He folded the letter, gently, as one might a relic or a farewell note. He tucked it back into the envelope and placed it into the satchel with the others. There would be no fire. Not yet. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew Elisa had deserved more than a disappearance. She had deserved to be heard. He stood. From the east, distant thunder rolled. Perhaps a train would never come again. Perhaps the tracks would remain as they were, frozen between choices never made and voices never raised. But Malcolm had chosen not silence, not noise, but the long, patient whisper of truth carried not by bell towers or pulpits, but by the relentless steps of those who refused to forget. He turned his back to the rails, and walked. Part 15. The silence remains. The wind in the city felt different than the one in the fields. It was colder, sharper, and always carrying with it a chorus of things left unsaid. When Father Malcolm stepped off the bus just past dawn, he found himself momentarily disoriented by the clamor of morning traffic and the gray stacks of concrete that seemed to press in from all directions. His shoes, still stained with mud from St. Mary's, tapped on the wet pavement as he crossed the quiet street toward the diocesan offices. The building rose like an impassive sentinel, its stone face shadowed by the rising sun. Within its halls, the bishop kept an office lined with old books, icons in gold leaf, and the kind of silence one associates with power. Malcolm's fingers were cold as he removed the envelope from his coat poquita. Thick ivory square, sealed in red, wax, no name, just a simple cross inked in black. Inside, the truth waited. The documents had been copied carefully. Dates and names matched against those found in Eliza's letters. He had enclosed the torn pages from her journal, the note from Grace, even the strip of lace that once adorned her veil. There was no accusation in the letter he wrote, only chronology, fact, implication. The kind of letter that would either be buried in a drawer or ignite the kind of inquiry that scorched whole institutions. Malcolm didn't ask for a meeting. He left the envelope with the secretary, nodded quietly, and walked back out into the city light. His apartment was as he left it, modest, clean, lined with books and languages most had forgotten. On the side table sat a wooden box with brass hinges, a keepsake from his own days in the service, one that had once carried bullets and letters of a very different kind. Now it would carry something else. One by one, he placed the items within. The remaining letters Eliza had written, the photograph from her vows, the charred edge of the coded message from the fireplace, the pressed lavender from beneath her pillow, and the veil cleaned, folded, and wrapped in soft cloth. The last item was a small crucifix, its back engraved with initials he hadn't seen until now, E.M. He lit a single candle and placed it near the box. The flame flickered gently in the dim light, casting long shadows across the room. It was quiet, save for the soft ticking of a wall clock. Outside, traffic roared, distant and impersonal. But in that room, there was only stillness. Malcolm sat in the armchair by the window, the box resting on his lap. The events of the past days had etched something new onto his face. Not age, not weariness, but something closer to knowing. There would be no press release, no headlines, only the quiet understanding that somewhere, someone had heard Eliza, and that, perhaps, was enough. Justice had not come with sirens. It came with a letter, a veil, a box, and a man who chose not to forget. As the candle burned lower, Malcolm leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered a name not meant to vanish, Eliza. And in that moment, the silence did not feel empty. It felt like memory.